Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action.
Jess Roberts, thank you so much for joining us today. And as a professional faculty or affiliate faculty member like myself, you are affiliated with University of Minnesota, Public Health, and also the Minnesota Design Center. So no one better suited, in my opinion, to talk to us about wicked problems. So it sounds like an outdated term, but I think it's probably still relevant. Or maybe it is a relevant term. You tell us, Jess, but welcome. And what the heck is a wicked problem?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So a wicked problem differs a little bit from, I think, what we think of a more traditional problem, in that traditional problems are, they're complicated. There's a lot of challenges to arriving at a correct answer, but they are solvable. You invest enough people, resource, energy, there tends to be a viable outcome. And this is really the domain of expertise, right? That's where it works really well. Wicked problems, on the other hand, that I think we're increasingly dealing with are those that aren't necessarily solvable in the traditional sense. The variables of the problem are unknown or constantly evolving. So you can't even have sort of a static place to test your assumptions. And this is really the domain of emergence, right? So the ability to sort of learn your way forward, which is from the design world, kind of how we're trained, which is this iterative way of taking small steps, seeing what happens. If it's not what you thought was supposed to happen, great, right? Like, what does that mean for the next iteration? And so that space of emergence is really critical in the sort of wicked problem space. And I think pretty unique education. Design is a pretty unique education to being able to create a structure for navigating when we don't have those guideposts, those solid guideposts to sort of pivot from. Think early days of COVID, whether that was how do we treat this, how do we prevent it, how do we work, right? It was a lot of that uncertainty. And I think politically, scientifically, we probably could have benefited from a bit more of a sort of design-like approach in those early days.
Well, I think there's a lot of domains where we would say that we would have benefited from some design or designer-like thinking. What you call traditional problems, I call tame problems. And you'd said it very well that they have solutions. Might be tough, but there's a solution. And I love that you touched on the mindset and the process of addressing wicked problems. And we'll talk about that in a later episode, is specifically about the mindset and process of design thinking. But they're very similar in this idea of learning our way forward, which I call optimism, that belief in a better way, and leaving that space for emergence, that's hard. So is it more natural for students than professionals, or is it kind of human nature? Are students better at holding space for emergence because they're students and not professionals, or is it just like humans have trouble with this in general?
Humans have trouble with it in general to a degree because we love certainty. And sometimes we seek that certainty with such vigor, we'll glom onto something and make it certain, even if it's not. But there is a lot of research on creativity, for example, that shows your peak creativity tends to be before your exposure to becoming educated, becoming a professional. So expertise, and in my classes, I often sort of look at, we'll probably talk about, the lived experience and expertise being sort of needing to be sort of mutually benefiting your process. But expertise can be pretty blinding, right? We become experts in things really quickly. So I often start my coursework doing a creativity test. It's an alternative uses test. So any object you can sort of think of, like, write as many uses as you can think of for this. And usually about 2% will score exceptional on that test of college students and adults. But kindergartners, like 90% will score exceptional because they start asking fundamentally different questions. Their familiarity or expertise in a paperclip, for example, is really different than ours, right? We know what it's used for, but they'll ask things like, well, what if it was 10 feet tall? Or what if it was made of
Right.
rubber, right?
Right.
Suddenly you realize like that pivot opens you up to endlessly more opportunities than, well, it's this metal, 1.5 inch, coil of wire. Well, you're pretty limited suddenly. And we do that, right? That's just our default because we'd be exhausted trying to sort of question everything every day, right? But we need to be really thoughtful about when that might be an appropriate approach to be able to start to ask some of those questions. And sometimes, again, the expertise can get in the way, and that unintentional blindness to what the opportunities are because we've already dictated a certain direction in what we're doing.
I love that. And it's a classic test. The other one I love is the marshmallow challenge, right?
Yeah.
Same idea. CEOs score the lowest.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, kindergartners score the highest. And it goes back to Picasso. He said, we're all born artists. The challenge is to remain an artist as we get older. And I'm familiar with that story. I love the idea of a 10-foot paperclip. Well, what that really comes down to, and I agree that wicked problems by definition are defined as wicked because of the external forces, but also the people who are involved in that process.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem I find with people in the process is that they don't take the time to, you touched on this, and I want to pull on this thread a little bit more, but they don't take the time to question the obvious. Like they don't, just as you said, like, oh yeah, paper clips are these little, no. Well, what if they're not? And so what's the value or what are skills that we can embody? And then ultimately, what's the benefit of taking the time to ask questions of the question?
Right. And I think that's where, having worked in healthcare for a time, and really any sector where folks get hung up, right? It's because we are focused on better solving, right? But in design, where we know the value proposition is in better, problem framing, just like the
Right.
paperclip, right? If you reframe the problem, suddenly you open yourself up to so many different potential pathways that didn't exist otherwise. And we kind of just keep going back to, in the expertise model, it's, well, we know this is the problem without questioning it and spend all of our time in the solving, when in fact, if you look back, most of human history, the breakthroughs were the few folks who said, I don't think that's the problem, right? They've taken that step back, they've reframed the problem, and that's where the breakthroughs come through. Because, in healthcare, I would often ask, like, of the hundreds, thousands of health systems that are working on this same specific problem, wouldn't one of us have stumbled across the viable solution if this was truly the problem we intended to solve?
Correct. So perfectly said. Like that is, I wish I could frame that example and hang it on the wall, because that is the essence of this discussion. So that will be on the final, as we like to say in the classroom. Good one. But, let's move this forward a little bit and say, okay, so let's just say we do take the time to ask the right question. Then as we begin to put definition on that redefined problem space or opportunity space, however you want to describe it, compare and contrast for us your experience and also your kind of theoretical understanding of, well, here's what's wrong, let's fix it, versus with quantifiable evidence versus here's my experience or here's my intuition based on this kind of nebulous collection of life experiences. And although I don't have data to back it up, I feel very strongly about X.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where, again, the sort of lived experience and sort of expertise come together. I often discuss sort of what's the productive tension between these spaces, right? Because if we go all quantifiable or all quality, right, it is neither of those paths alone is going to be helpful. So usually I'm starting with, what do we know? What is quantifiable, right? It may be, and again, I do a lot of work in the health space, but we know a certain population has a much increased risk of, dying of cancer because it's being caught later, right? Because they're not doing preventive screening. Well, the sort of quantitative means we need people to get screened. Well, yeah, we've been doing that for a really long time, but we don't see movement in those numbers, right?
Right.
The design approach is the why, right? Like, what is driving folks? And you'll hear things like it isn't, we'll default to the technical, right? It needs to be education, or maybe they just don't have transportation. But when you really dig into people's experiences, it's more like things like they lack confidence, or they're really fearful of what they will hear, right? And
Mm.
so designing to that, designing for fear, designing to improve confidence in the healthcare space are really different activities than we just need to educate people better or more about the importance of preventive screenings. It is people make those decisions. They default to the experience, to their lived experience and priorities and traumas and everything else that you need to understand if you're designing for a particular population, or you're just going to kind of keep doing the same thing. And in some instances, you make it worse, right? Like, oh, you just
Yeah.
need more information. Well, if I was feeling a lack of confidence, more information that I don't understand probably makes me less confident and moves me further away from doing something.
Yeah, to your point, one of the examples we had, we were designing coming out of the pandemic and how to engage people who may have been, either scared away from the health system because of fear of contracting COVID,
Mm-hmm.
or, for other reasons, be it political or what have
Mm-hmm.
you, were kind of against that whole thing, and how to bring them back into the fold. And so one of the solutions we came up with it was called the mom bus, and it was a bus that would go into neighborhoods so that mothers could get and their children could get the necessary developmental care, right? That they wouldn't miss out on timely interventions just because of fear. And that sounded really great. And clearly the health system I was working with, we were not the only ones with that idea. But the insight that we had that was unique was the moms didn't want to be seen getting on the bus because it stigmatized them as having a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows that it's preventative on that bus. It just means something's wrong. And that's advertising to the neighborhood that I've got something wrong. And so to your point, yes, we designed for convenience, we designed for access, but we didn't design for fear.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't bring into full account the depth of the traumas that people brought out of that experience. And I think, and I'll ask you this question for your opinion, but if we take time to design for every trauma, every opinion, right, how the heck do we get anywhere? How do we get anything done? So what's the balance between being empathic and yet moving things forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's similar to, design. You design your way towards a solution sort of iteratively. It's similar in that problem space, right? You need to really, if it is fear, really understanding what that looks like and understanding it from a variety of perspectives. Where else in someone's life are they fearful of doing something? Or maybe conversely, where have folks overcome that fear and draw from that? So it's the theme of fear. It's not necessarily a specific fear, right? So it's about gleaning those insights, again, embedded in people's experiences where they themselves might not understand it, right? But as a designer, to sort of ferret out those things that, I was really afraid of riding the bus because I didn't know what to do when I got on the bus. But
Right.
then my sister, who, rode the bus all the time, let me ride with her, and I did it once and felt really comfortable doing it and never thought of it again, right? So a peer navigation may be a really beneficial, application to address some of that fear. Seeing someone I trust or like my lived experience doing something can have a really positive impact, far more impactful than simply, another brochure from the healthcare system where it has a person that might look like me, it's so abstracted.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. That definitely makes sense. So kind of moving forward, talking about that, if I'm a student and I have an idea, or I'm new at a company, or maybe at a lower level in the hierarchy at a company, I bring an experience to the table, but the people who are either the teachers, or maybe it's just a senior versus a freshman in a college setting, or a manager versus an individual contributor in an organization, what have you, who may bias towards the lever of expertise. You have the experience, but I have the expertise. And that's a common tool used to, when you question the question, to get, no, back to I know best. Like, why do people do that? How can we reframe that? And is there an opportunity for those with experience to thrive when they're in an organization that values expertise?
Yeah, I think there is. I think one of the things I'll often share with students is like it's just picking a place to start and don't over plan, don't overscale things, because that's another sort of, I think, human habit we have is that we want to get too scaled up. Like we want to inform the solution before we even start the journey. So it's like, where are those small safe spaces where we can expose and bring in some of those lived experiences? This is, I think, probably more important right now than at any other point in human history because of like shifts in demographics, right? Like what are young people's experience in the world and how fundamentally different that might look from the folks with the expertise and making decisions devoid of that, right? So I think connecting it to sort of bottom line mission, all of those things is where I found value in the past, but really recognizing like this is a population where we don't serve well. It could be an expanded consumer base, right? Really focusing on, are there particular segments of the population where we don't do well now or really have maybe some potential misalignments? And we hear it on the news all the time, right? Now about how different Gen Z, for example, sees and experiences the world than previous generations. And so that's a real opportunity space in the business space. And then again, sort of defaulting to, this doesn't mean I need 3 years and, $1.5 million to explore this. No, you can do this really scrappy. Like design is scrappy with like whatever you have the space and opportunity to influence, start there. Don't try to get to the perfect, because a lot of times just by, starting where you can, you learn that your previous assumption of perfect would have been wrong anyway.
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back. Well, we talked about this idea of tame versus wicked problems, where a tame problem may be difficult but has a solution, where a wicked problem has confusing information, stakeholders with conflicting values, and as you talked about, the risk of maybe over-indexing to the data versus lived experiences can create a less optimal outcome than we would have gotten otherwise, and we know that's a huge risk. So let's talk about the topic du jour, Jess, and apply this to AI. So I'll ask you point blank, do you think AI is a wicked problem, and why?
I think the technology itself is not a wicked problem. I think the application of it is probably a wicked problem. And I think in particular, because, we hear the debates, a lot of your students, right? It's, well, how do we catch people from using AI, right? Instead of, well, maybe AI shifts how we actually like the skill sets we can bring as humans into what we do, right? I think I just saw a statistic this morning of something like 80% of the jobs that'll be available in another 10 years don't even exist yet, or exist in a totally different way, right? Like this is a really, the speed is what is another dynamic that we're not used to, right? The Industrial Revolution was a real slow build and burn. AI is just disrupting things at a pace that humans can't keep up to. So I think the technology inherently isn't wicked. It is, how do we apply it is it dangerous, right? There's a lot of conversation of will it take us over, right? So I think that aspect of AI could be a problem. But again, I think it's really thinking about, given AI is very much about connection and networked intersections, we can't rely on the previous assumptions of how the world works or the expertise pools that were better suited for like that industrial approach, which is mechanistic and linear. This is a fundamentally different way of operating, and the predictability, right? You said wicked problems, the variability or the variables are constantly changing. So how do you solve for something that's not static? Like AI is a prime example of like even the engine you're using, and it's learning from you and everyone else, and then the addition, the iterations of the updates themselves, right? You can't keep up to because it's constantly evolving.
I think you bring up a great point is that if I've built a 20, 25-year career on business, that linear business, if you think about back to the individuals who are in those positions, right? They grew up in a generation where, hey, your brother or your older sibling they get first crack, but if you just wait your turn, you'll get your crack as well. And now we're seeing that AI has disrupted that, again, linear progression, whether it's a linear promotion process or it's a linear functional process in an organization, it's being fundamentally disrupted. And as I'm seeing it, many companies have successfully implemented AI pilots, but it's actually the organization structure within the company that's preventing AI from becoming more ubiquitous. And it's because the people who are making those decisions are like, wait a second, I've waited my turn. I'm not ready to let this AI cut in front of me and take that opportunity from me. Whereas someone who is, as you or I might teach in an undergraduate curriculum or even a graduate curriculum, right, somewhere in their 20s, they're more native to technology. Even if it was started with social media, they understand that that's fundamentally changed their social relationships. And so that when AI now comes in as a technology that's threatening to disrupt the professional business as usual, right, or that normal way of doing business, they're open to that. And I'm not saying that it's the answer, right? We can, as you said, I 1000% agree. AI is not a wicked problem. It's the use of the technology by humans that creates the wicked problem. 1000% agree. And so with that, should we be relying on people in our organizations who are more digitally native or frankly have less invested in the status quo to help us challenge what we think to be true and welcome these new opportunities into our workflow? It's a very interesting dynamic, and one when we debrief this conversation, even just a week ago, the idea of experience versus expertise, it's really grown as I've sat with it. And I think it's really fundamental to this issue of wicked problems.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is sort of a questioning of, there's been industry and sectors that you can see, right? They're instead of exploring how does AI improve how we might do what we're trying to do, and again, it may mean, it's that reframing the problem. Are we doing a very specific set of things that we think results in something, or was the expectation we want to, improve educational outcome, we want to improve health outcomes, right? Like whatever it might be, because that's a different design process. And instead of this sort of protectionism of, well, we're going to write it into our contract that AI can't take away what we do, right? Which is like, well, what are you saying if AI can already do what you do? Versus like, how are we leveraging the technology to deliver what we know is better outcomes, right? Because that, again, gets us in the reframing space, which a lot of humans, a lot of professionals, a lot of folks that have been doing something a very specific way for a very long time are really uncomfortable with. And that's where I think young people with that, familiarity are much better at sort of, in design, we'll talk about hacking a lot, right? Hacking the systems because you're finding the workarounds in real time. And sometimes the workarounds are really great breakthroughs in how we might function differently in programs we might design or policy changes, versus, the level of discussion at the federal policy level, right? When they had the social media companies there, and you have senators asking like, well, how do you pay for this? right? Like total
Right, right, right.
disconnect from, so instead of like hoping that there's sort of top down like instruction on this, it is really true to the design process that we need to bring in people with that familiarity to kind of tinker and hack to learn where and how might this actually be, mutually beneficial for our organization, for what we do, for our bottom line, for serving our, clients and end users better. That's how you navigate a wicked problem versus try to control the problem.
I love that it's not something that we can control. So if it's not something that we can put our finger on the scale and control, then my instinct is to peel back a layer and ask, what are the systems underneath that are directing this process, right? What's that first principle beneath the surface? And this is where, in my experience, systems thinking plays a very key role. And I know that you use it a lot in your work. It's an area of interest to you. So for those who may not be versed in it, what is systems thinking? And then maybe if you could extend that analogy a little bit into this context and use case of AI.
Yeah. So in systems thinking, and I think for your students, a great, really high level resource is the Water of Systems Change. And it sort of looks at three layers, right? It's the structural change or the explicit. That's the stuff we experience every day. It's the policies, practices. It's how we decide where resources go, right? And this is, this can be at the federal policy level. It can be at the organizational level and even interpersonal level. Then you have the relational change. So who's part of that process? What are those perspectives, those lived experiences, those expertise that go into influencing these things? And then ultimately at the lowest level, it's what are the mental models that drive those things, right? And so we always, again, the problem with just sort of trying to fix things and we focus on the solving instead of sometimes the reframing is that we kind of keep just attaching at that structural change level, like, well, let's add this or tweak this, not realizing the driver is happening at that, level below. That's what's really influencing these outcomes. And that's where, something like AI, like you mentioned, it wasn't like, how are we going to apply this? It's how do we change as an organization? What are the policies and practices that allow us to operate in a fundamentally different way? Otherwise, we're just doing a lot of, I have a architecture background, right? So you can,
no wonder you're drawn to design.
Right. The metaphor for me is you build the home and then you realize, oh, I kind of wanted, solar panels, so we'll tack those on, or I wanted a little more space, so we'll do an addition, right? Like we kind of keep building on, but it wasn't fundamentally designed into what makes this a home, right? And similar at an organization or, at a state, federal level, it's what is that sort of outcome and how do we shift to align with some of these opportunities and avoid some of the potential downfalls to do this well rather than dictate, an outcome that, is informed by the environments in which you create. And I think at the core, that's what design thinking, human-centered design brings to systems thinking. It's what it brings to organizations is that we can talk about systems all day, but devoid of the people, they're still abstractions of reality. They still operate in a really logical way, even if you sort of map everything. The humans are the illogical elements that can blow that all up, right? And so we really need to understand how the role the humans play, those feelings, those emotions, those hopes, those fears, understand how that influences and plays within that system, because that's where we really need, again, back to our, I think, starting point, which is what does designing to trust look like, or a confidence versus some specific outcome we've already predetermined.
Yeah. So designing away from fear towards trust versus this is the tangible outcome. Right. And that to come full circle in this conversation, just like that is really what I feel the essence of design is. And we talked about optimism in the mindset. It's having empathy for, fear, having an optimism of trust, and in that process, trying to fight that vortex of the status quo. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but that's my reaction, experiential reaction to what you just shared, and because it's so spot on.
Yeah, and one thing I do that I think really illustrates this is I'll ask healthcare leaders, when I do presentation for, healthcare leaders and executives, I'll ask them to describe the last time they genuinely felt well or happy, right?
Oh boy.
And number one,
Wow.
it's like, what do you mean? Right? Like
Right.
folks in that position, it's like, what's the answer you need from me versus the design question, which is, I don't know, right? And what you universally hear are the very things that they don't pay attention to in their day-to-day job, right? Which is keeping people healthy and well and happy, because in their day-to-day job, it's, blood pressures and A1Cs and cholesterol levels. In their own health and well-being, it's about, unstructured time off with friends and family. It's
Right.
downtime. It's those things that are not as easily quantifiable. You can't put a cuff on and measure those things, but it's how they themselves make decisions. And it's how most of us make decisions on our health. And yet we practice our professional approach and personal approaches to health in that space are fundamentally different and sometimes at odds with one another.
Yeah, those were literally the next words coming out of my mouth, is that they are fundamentally at odds.
Yeah.
So with that being said, the correct answer, in my opinion, is, well, define wellness as you laid out. Here's my blood pressure, but also here's my, using my Aura ring to say, well, here's my sleep number. Mm-hmm. My blood pressure is fine, but my sleep number sucks, to that end. Like, how do we make space for the unexpected in these situations, where once we take the time to actually ask that right question and to ideate around those human-centered elements versus those outcome-driven elements?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this again sort of touches on, like I mentioned, the productive tension. It's really difficult. It took me a little while to realize, but in design, we would, it's like, why are you putting so many constraints on the design of this, dance studio or whatever, when I was in my training. And then you realize if you didn't have those things, it's almost impossible to design, right? In design, you need criteria that help you to start, that help navigate the work. And so those productive tensions are critical for doing any of this. And so in design, it's what's informing those productive tensions and how are you creating a space that moves you forward? Because the reality, whether you're in an organization or elsewhere, is you got to produce something, right? You have to move towards a solution, but there's also a way of doing that that allows for the unexpected to emerge, right? Most folks educated in business policy making, it is very much about, we will determine the solution and then validate with those emotions and people, right? And
yes.
if it's not validated, we'll find people who will validate it, right? And say, yep.
And that's where the traditional management consultant makes their money.
Right. And focus groups, right? Like if I'm giving you options, people will always respond to them, even if it's completely irrelevant to their lived realities, right?
Let alone the social pressures of conforming.
Right, exactly.
Like we could talk about the mistakes all day, but I agree 100%.
And I think, again, design, that iterative way of working, taking the sort of learning your way forward, like you do in Wicked Problems, is about creating enough structure so you're still, it's sort of a compass versus a map. I have a direction. I don't have a specific destination, but I have a direction. So I'm moving forward, but I still have that space for, oh, this is surprising. Let's explore that a little bit further. Because again, that's where the breakthroughs occur. And most of my clients that I work with, you usually hear things like that. Like, I wouldn't have thought to ask that, or I would have never thought of that. Right. And that's the point. We make decisions with such a homogenous, small group of folks that we miss all of the expertise and infinite lived experience outside of that small circle of folks. And so how do we do better to tap some of that rich opportunity to inform the design when we're actually designing, rather than we've already created the solution, now we need validation?
Yeah, that's two comments I want to make there that you triggered. Is one, I always use the definition of design thinking as desirability, feasibility, and then viability, meaning start with the needs of users. Is it technologically feasible? And then does it make money?
Mm-hmm.
And most companies have already gotten to that making money point. That's why I ask, like, why do you need an iPhone 16? Go.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody, like, it's bigger.
Yeah.
My contract was up, right? Like that's this feasibility, viability loop. And it makes an infinity symbol if you think of it. And so it's very difficult to break that and go all the way back to, well, the users actually want communication. And if that iPhone was a triangle instead of a rectangle, like they would still buy it because they want communication, not just because of the iPhone 17. And that's a case of the business outcome, that profitability justifying the technological investment and then pulling the users or pushing the users into that agreement. Whereas on the flip side of that, if you create space, creating that space for the unknown, it's, if my goal is communication, how many different avenues can I pursue to express that communication? And I think that's fundamentally the difference that people face, is that there's infinite opportunities if you focus on the human-centered aspect, as you talked about. And just because the technology may not be there today doesn't mean that there isn't, as you said earlier, a scrappier, lower fidelity way to go about validating that user-centered need, knowing that the technology will ultimately catch up.
Right. And a lot of businesses fall prey to the sexy new technology. We have a tool, we have a solution. Now we have to search for a problem to solve with it, right? Which is another really backwards way of approaching, right? Like, we don't care what type of problem this is here. It's just a really cool solution. So there's got to be something out there we could pigeonhole it into.
Yeah. Well, as my mentor, Clark Kellogg, always says, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right. Yeah.
And so I always put that slide up in an opening lecture, a picture of a hammer with a screw, and everyone's like, that's ridiculous. Of course. But how many times does this happen in real life? One thing you touched on very briefly, and I just want to make a comment about this, was you talked about your kind of hierarchy in the systems thinking world, and getting down to those mental models. And you talked about the difference between having a compass versus having a map. And one of the first mental models that I learned was the map is not the territory. It's a representation because it's at scale, and it's typically two-dimensional, and you can put lines to to show three dimensions. But in reality, you're taking a three-dimensional space, reducing it to two dimensions, and compacting the scale. And so you're never going to have an exact orientation to the physical landscape. And that translates to design, is that you can design in a vacuum to perfection. But once you actually interact with those users, you can guarantee that it's going to change. And so success in design, I found, is not being perfect in theory, but it's actually being flexible in practice, staying aligned with the compass analogy that you used, but understanding what our true north is. And if that true north is your user-centered need, I think there's a lot better possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really at the core of my education, which is a sort of studio model of learning, and about, just reliably sharing your work with peers, with experts, with users, and realizing, again, back to the expertise trap, how quickly you became blind to the opportunities. So many times after I'd have one of those pinups and go, this is where back to the drawing board literally came from, right? You'd go back and revise. It would occur to me, like, how did I miss that? I mean, why wasn't I asking that question? It seems so basic, but again, it's because I became so expert in what I was doing that I missed those opportunities. So that's the design structure of, like, get outside of that, expose those assumptions and biases and lack of expertise or lived experience to inform when you can actually do something with that.
Yeah. Explore to inform.
Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. Well, Jess, I'd like to end these conversations and more importantly, model for our students the benefit of ending every conversation with the question, what haven't I asked you that you think it's important we know about?
I think also just the role that maybe design can play in a sort of I think that's relevant right now, is a situation of, polarization politically and otherwise.
Yeah, please.
Because the work that I do, I find that when you start with curiosity and focus on lived experience, it isn't this abstract argument. It's not a them and us, right? It is a way of bringing people together that I think is far more efficient and productive than a lot of the other ways we try to sort of like, we can debate and everything else, but even debates, they exist in the abstract. And I think design is just a really core structure for how do we bring people together? How do we connect on what we all value? Because there's some fundamental values that cut across political, cultural, geographical lines. And we could all do a lot better to facilitate, again, this design process that isn't about, I need to convince you to get to my way of thinking versus there's a space here and we all are seeking safety or joy and understanding the different ways that that can show up, right? If you can do that well, not only, will your business be really successful, but you're going to be able to bring people together in ways that are just far more productive than, these, 30-second arguments.
Yeah. It's social media was not designed for coming together. And so but we've modeled our communication to the form, as you would say, the function is following the form, unfortunately. Whereas in design, we lead into the form following the function. And if that function is togetherness, then the process of design thinking as a method and systems thinking together as a method to address these wicked problems seems only apt. Well, Jess, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much. This is a perfect conversation to launch us into this series on the podcast, but also into this semester in the classroom as we just laid the very basics of wicked problems and versus tame problems and the benefits of design thinking and system thinking as a way to challenge the question before converging on a solution and balancing the lived experience in that designed solution versus that quantifiable, identified experience to really come up with those human-centered outcomes. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks. Wow. What a great conversation with Jess. It always is great to talk with fellow practitioners, learn how they do their craft, and bring the best into our classroom. As we say, steal like an artist. One thing that really struck me that he talked about was this idea of experience versus expertise. As CEOs, for example, they have the expertise, right? I've been in this industry 25 years. Whereas someone who has a lived experience, that's just as, if not more valuable than that experience that is gained just from being tangential to a lived experience. So just reinforcing the idea of always going back to our customers. But that one point that I can't agree with more is this concept of wicked problems being unsolvable in the traditional sense. Just using the standard approach of convergent thinking with tested frameworks and the business as usual approach will always come up short instead of taking that divergent perspective, gathering new information, challenging dogmas, and really driving something that's human-centered off of those fresh insights. We saw this in the COVID example. And when you are dealing with a situation that has evolving variables, this just reminds us that we cannot be in a position of relying on static solutions. Diving a little bit deeper on this experience versus expertise piece, particularly in his healthcare example, and illustrating that difference between the quantitative data. You can obviously say, well, what people aren't getting screened versus the qualitative human element, understanding fear, lack of confidence. This always comes back to Doug Dietz in his TED Talk from many years ago. That was really a seminal moment in the history of design thinking. And he talked about redesigning the MRI machine, and not just the machine itself, but that experience for the patient. And experience as the patient didn't make it into the boardroom where expertise ruled. And in that sense, expertise was engineers talking about how to make the images more crisp, how to increase throughput, and so forth. Whereas when you begin to bring in the patient themselves, you begin to understand that, gosh, as Doug said, he thought it was things like, is my boss going to be mad if I'm missing work? And that's true. But going further is just, as a parent, it's gutting to think that you're putting your child into a situation that they may not get through or may have difficulty getting through. and bringing pain on them as a way to try and find a solution. So I think that instead of just trying to educate people better about human experiences, we need to understand that at the core, people live on trust, as an example, and that what should be the status quo is designing for trust. Another metaphor that Jess used in the conversation was this idea of the compass versus the map. And we talked about the map is not the territory, and we're much better equipped to go in with a compass. So, for example, if you have a professor who's giving you an exam and you're allowed to bring in a sheet with some formulas and so forth written on it, those are compasses. But to actually try and write out individual problems that were on the review sheet and you just pray are on the exam, right? That's relying upon the map. And how many times have we talked about or just seen where executives are relying on a tried and true method rather than trusting their instincts, or even more extreme, trusting their underlings' instincts in a situation? It's a big leap, but it usually brings out a better outcome. You know, what I thought could go a little bit further, and I would have loved to spend more time on it, is the idea of the expertise trap. And Jess talked about this in terms of the paperclip example. And we're so bound by just the visual of a metal paperclip that's used to hold paper together, and which for many of us is obsolete, just like the stapler or the tape dispenser. But the point being is that if we view it for its ability to connect things, if we use it as ability for security, right? Holding two things together in a way that they won't come apart. That's where the human-centered piece comes in. And when we allow that creativity to come to the surface, we can find those kinds of insights. And also, finally, I would say Jess did a great job highlighting the idea of problem framing versus problem solving and taking the time to identify the right problem. So most breakthroughs come from reframing the problem, not better solving, as he said, and explain, this shift definitely helps from just optimizing for that one-off solution to questioning the fundamental premise of that problem itself. Thank you for listening. I would encourage you all to scan the QR code in the book, or click on the link in the show notes and go to this chapter of the book. Have a read and give us your thoughts. If you've already got the book, then we look forward to you bringing this discussion to class or to our next executive session and building upon this concept of wicked problems. And if all else fails, talk to your classmates or your colleagues and ask them, do they think AI is a wicked problem? And see what responses you get.